Today's show is sponsored by Gaia GPS. Navigate, track, and explore with Gaia GPS, the gold standard of topographic maps and offline navigation tools. Please go to GaiaGPS.com, that's GAIAGPS.com/history10s, history10s, and get 20% off on a 1-year membership or up to 50% off on a 5-year membership. When we talk about world history, I think we as human beings often are making the assumption that us human beings are in complete control of how everything turns out. Maybe more specifically, it's always humans who are making the decisions on how things are going to go. We can talk about wars that went a certain way because it was based on the decisions of the people who fought them. We can talk about how a Chinese dynasty fell, either from the actions of the people within China or from the actions of the people outside of China, such as Mongol invaders. We can talk about how a great invention was made and the effects that it had on our society, such as how tanks played a key role towards the end of the First World War. The point is, human beings are the ones making the decisions. We assume that it's human beings who decide how a historical event will unfold, because at some point or another, the actions that happen are the result of a person's decision, or a group of people deciding together. But what if that's not entirely true? What if human beings, many times, aren't in control of how things go? What if we find ourselves at times at the absolute mercy of other forces? Forces that we can't control. Forces that aren't human. We talked about this a little bit in our first show, and please feel free to check it out when you can. But in that show, we were talking about something similar. We were talking about 10 times where it wasn't a human who was deciding the course of history. It was animals. 10 times in that show, we talked about how a certain animal species changed the course of history. Bees were used as weapons in medieval warfare. A monkey bite killed a Greek monarch. A Newfoundland dog saved the life of Napoleon. A cow kicked over a lamp and started the Great Chicago Fire. Human beings weren't in control those times. History was decided because of something that wasn't human. But now with this show today, I want to go a little further than that. I want to talk some more about how humans may not be in full control of their destiny, because there are forces out there that can decide the future of our civilizations that aren't human. And they're not animals either. They're not alive at all. They are sheer forces of nature. And these are sheer forces of nature that we as human beings have no control over whatsoever. It's a little freaky to think about, isn't it? I don't think any of us like the idea of not being in control of our destinies. That there are forces outside our control deciding whether we live a certain way or not, or whether we live at all, based on a force that's outside our control. So what the heck am I talking about here? What are these forces that I'm talking about that are beyond our control? There's many, to be honest, and over time we can get into all of them. But today I want to focus on one. Weather. Think about it. How often has history been defined because of a major weather event? An event that we couldn't control, and in some cases didn't even see coming until it was right on top of us. Well, you'd be surprised how often it happens, and how often we as human beings are not in control of our destinies. We are merely at the mercy of a great wind that can sweep it all away. Batten down the hatches, folks. This is 10 times that weather changed the course of world history. I'm Andrew Baldwin, and this is the History 10s.
We're go, flight. Okay, we're go. We're go. Train high. We're go. Altitude 1600. Eagle looking great.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
That's what they did.
And the severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy tornadoes. Undoubtedly Japanese.
Let us pray for the salvation of all of those who live in that totalitarian darkness.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Light with growing confidence and growing strength in the air.
This is the History 10s. 10,
It's the 13th century, and we're in the Far East. Now, you may have heard the name Genghis Khan, the great Mongol ruler who united the tribes of the Asian steppe, which is the region of southern Siberia, Mongolia, and Northeast Asia. And he led one of the greatest and bloodiest conquests in world history. Over the course of the Mongol invasions of the 13th century throughout Asia and Eastern Europe, over 9 million square miles of land were conquered, and over 40 million people were killed. Now, Genghis Khan died in 1227, but when he did, the Mongol conquest didn't stop. In some places, they actually accelerated, which leads us up to 1266 and the start of our first story. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, has now taken over the throne of the Mongol Empire. He's defeated southern China, and he's now united the country under the newly formed Yuan dynasty. And now, with his great conquest of China done, Kublai Khan is turning his sights a little further to the east, to an island that's on the other side of a narrow sea, the island of Japan. Now, Kublai Khan starts by sending emissaries across to Japan in 1266, basically saying, bow to us, send tribute to your true emperor, and if you don't, you'll die. Now, the Japanese, they're bold. They say no. So then in 1268, Kublai Khan tries again with some more emissaries. And again, the Japanese say no. Then Kublai Khan tries twice in 1269, then again in 1271, and then again in 1272. Each time, no, 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 and no. So finally, Kublai Khan's had enough. Now, he needs a couple more years to consolidate his forces, but in 1274, he's put together a massive army by the standards of the time. Now, the estimates are pretty much all over the place, but it's believed that he had somewhere around 40,000 men and 900 ships. And now it's on. So this army gets sent out by Kublai Khan. They specifically set out from the Korean peninsula because it's the closest land point to Japan. And they arrive on the southern tip of the Japanese island of Kyushu. And there they come face to face with 10,000 Japanese samurai who were dug in and waiting for them. Now, what followed is a series of battles that are collectively called the Battle of Bunai. And if I mispronounce that, I sincerely apologize. That might happen a bit in these shows. Anyway, unfortunately for the Japanese, the Mongols once again demonstrated why they were able to conquer so much territory and inflict so much death and destruction. The Mongols are possibly centuries ahead of their time in terms of their fighting skills when they can put an army into the field. They fight with amazing skill on their horses. And so as a result, they sweep the Japanese from the field. It was a solid first victory for the Mongols, and pretty much everyone's seeing the writing on the wall of, well, what's going to happen to Japan is exactly what happened to China. The Mongols are just going to roll them over. But after this first series of battles where the Japanese are driven back, the Mongols made a tactical mistake. They decided, for safety, to retreat back to their ships, just in case the Japanese army returned with more reinforcements, and so the Mongols wanted a place to hunker down. So now the Mongols are in their ships at night. And that night, the rain starts. Then the wind, and then the waves. A massive typhoon. And a typhoon is, by the way, what they call hurricanes in the North Pacific. They just call them by the name typhoon. So a massive typhoon strikes the coast and sweeps away most of the Mongol fleet. Hundreds of ships were sunk. Thousands of Mongol troops were drowned. Completely depleted from this massive storm, the Mongol army had no choice but to turn around and limp back home. So the first invasion of Japan had failed. Now, not to be defeated, and considering that defeat was practically unknown for the Mongols up until that time, Kublai Khan decides 7 years later in 1281 to try again. And this time, he really isn't messing around, and he brings back an even larger force. This time, it's estimated to be around 140,000 soldiers and 4,400 ships. Now, again, I want to clarify, we don't know the real numbers for sure. Old history has kind of a knack for inflating numbers. So, again, these are estimates, but the real numbers aren't known for sure. But still, it's pretty clear that it was a massive force that Kublai Khan put together. So, this amazingly huge army set sail from two locations this time, the Korean Peninsula again, and mainland China. The plan is to meet and attack in the same area that they landed in the 1274 invasion. But this time, considering that they had 7 years to prepare, the Japanese are definitely ready for them. You see, what the Japanese had done was, while waiting for 7 years for the Mongols to come back, and they certainly knew the Mongols were going to come back, they built massive seawalls all along the shore to protect themselves. So now the Mongols have a problem. Because of these seawalls, they now have nowhere suitable to land. And so they're forced to take their time and deplete a whole bunch of their supplies to find a landing point that's going to work for their army. Now, finally, August rolls around in 1281, and the Mongols finally believe they've found a place to land and prepare their assault that's going to wipe out the Japanese once and for all. And right as they're about to do this, it happens again. The wind, the rain, and the waves return. This time, an even more massive typhoon strikes and wipes out the Mongol fleet. The numbers are staggering. Some estimates believe as many as 4,000 of these 4,400 ships were destroyed by this one typhoon, and that over 80% of these Mongol soldiers were killed either by the storm or by the Japanese troops that attacked and finished off the remaining survivors of the storm. Once again, the tiny scraps of the Mongol fleet that survived this typhoon were forced to turn around and go back home. Japan was never attacked again by the Mongols, and the Mongols finally found the limits of how far they could go with their conquest. These two typhoons, these massive storms that killed thousands of men and saved Japan from Mongol conquest, are known today as kamikazes, which means divine wind. And actually, you may remember this name because of something else that happened in history. The name kamikaze gained a reputation in World War II because you had Japanese pilots, also called kamikazes, who would launch suicide attacks against American ships. But for this example, we're looking at the original meaning. Kamikaze was the name for the two storms that destroyed the Mongols, saved Japan from Mongol conquest, and spared the world from a really different future.
9.
There's an old historical saying that applies to strategic warfare. It's a saying that's a little controversial in some historical circles because there's a lot of historians that think there's a lot more to it than this simple concept. But I personally think there's a lot of truth to it as well. The saying is, don't invade Russia during the winter. Now, the reason why it's a little controversial is because you have to take into account many things about Russia. You have the massive population of people that can fight you, and of course you have the sheer geographic size of Russia. If you're going to invade the giant landmass that is Russia with an army, the largest country on Earth, by the way, you're going to have incredible logistical planning because of how long your supply lines are going to be. And you have to have the ability to have a huge number of quick-moving troops so you can cover such a large front. But on top of all of that, I'm going to go back, though, to my original saying and focus on that one. Because again, I believe there is so much truth to this line. You don't invade Russia during the winter. And the reason for this, I think, is pretty obvious. Russian winters aren't exactly known for being balmy, enjoyable affairs. Outside of Antarctica, Russia probably has the worst winter conditions on the planet. Massive snowstorms, strong winds, and of course, unbelievable cold. Temperatures well below zero are the norm until almost April in most parts of Russia. Interesting fact here, actually. The coldest permanently inhabited town in the world is actually in Russia, and it has seen temperatures as low as 88 degrees below zero. Folks, that's colder than the surface of Mars. So let's apply this incredible weather factor to history, and more specifically, strategic warfare. If you're an invading army and you're looking to attack and conquer Russia, who do you think is going to have the advantage when winter comes? You as the aggressor, who's constantly having to move across these open prairies and are constantly exposed to this unbelievable weather? Or is it going to be the defending Russian, who has lived their whole life dealing with this weather and is thus more in tune with it? Oh, and by the way, is able to dig in and fortify himself since he's simply on the defense and not having to move. Yeah, I think it's going to be the Russian who has the upper hand here. And this has resulted in Russia being able to be pretty much unconquerable in its entire history. Now, the one exception to this, of course, was the Mongol conquest of the 13th century, but I think you got to put a little asterisk next to them because the Mongols are in a special category all their own. And remember, they also come from very harsh conditions in Mongolia and South Siberia, which itself is part of Russia. So, again, little asterisks there. But again, the weather has played such a key advantage for Russian defenders over the centuries that there's actually a term for it: general winter. It also goes by General Frost or General Snow. So we're going to talk about 3 examples where General Winter played a key role in helping Russia be able to defend itself from foreign invaders. The first one, we're going to go back to the 18th century. King Charles XII of Sweden, who in 1708 decided to try an invasion of Russia as part of what was called the Great Northern War. So King Charles, he takes a sizable force from Saxony and he takes it into Russia to conquer Moscow. Now, for a time, he's successful and the Russians are just retreating. But then 2 things went wrong for King Charles. First of all, the Russians were using a scorched earth policy when they were retreating. What does that mean? It means that they were burning and destroying everything that they were retreating from, leaving no supplies or food available for King Charles's advancing army. And then, of course, the second thing, the winter weather. The winter of 1708 and 1709 is believed to have been the worst winter in the history of the 18th century. It was so bad that the waters in Venice, Italy, all the way to the south, froze solid. Now imagine if it's going to be that bad all the way down in Italy, how much worse is it going to be up north in Russia? Well, let's just say it didn't work out well for King Charles. When the winter started, Charles had about 35,000 men with him. But by the time the warm weather came back in 1709, only 19,000 of his men were left. In June of 1709, this once mighty army that had been knocking the Russians down hand over fist in 1708 was now only about half of its number, all because of the winter cold. And that army, a skeleton of its former self, was crushed in the Battle of Poltava. The Russians were victorious and the Swedes were defeated. Now, the second example I want to go to is in regards to one of the most famous conquerors in world history, Napoleon. It's 1812, and Napoleon has conquered pretty much all of Europe, except for one nation, Russia. So Napoleon decides that it's time to bring Russia to heel as well. And so he forms perhaps the greatest army in world history up until that time. A massive army of over 600,000 men that Napoleon would fittingly call the Grande Armée. And so off he goes with this Grande Armée into Russia. Once he was in Russia, Napoleon learned pretty quickly that the rules that he had been using to conquer most of Europe up to that point didn't really apply in Russia. Because first of all, because of the sheer distances in Russia, the Russian army could just pull back further and further, drawing this massive Grand Army further and further into the Russian landmass, stretching their supply lines, cutting off stragglers, and also, more importantly, denying Napoleon a chance at a massive battle where he could actually score a decisive victory. And by the time Napoleon finally got to fight his first, and really only major battle of the entire campaign into Russia, the Battle of Borodino, which he won, by the way, his army was already down to 2/3 of its original strength. So while Napoleon did win the Battle of Borodino and actually managed to capture Moscow, it wound up not doing anything for him. The Russians, knowing that Moscow was going to fall, adopted the same scorched earth policy that they used with King Charles XII, and they just burned Moscow down to the ground. And so now Napoleon finds himself in Moscow without any supplies of food or shelter. And of course, the Russian winter is coming. So with no choice, Napoleon has to go back to France. And it was on the roads back to France that the winter came and smashed what was left of his army. By the time Napoleon's once Grande Armée reached France, of the 600,000 men that he took into Russia, barely 100,000 were left. It was a staggering defeat, inflicted in part by the Russians and in part by General Winter. And it changed the course of history, sowing the seeds for Napoleon's downfall. And finally, for the third example, we have a modern example. I'm talking about World War II and Adolf Hitler's attempt to conquer the Soviet Union. Hitler attacked Russia in June of 1941 with what was the largest military offensive in world history, and still is to this day, by the way. Over 3 million men. But in the end, even the largest military offensive in world history wasn't successful. You had the problem of the Russians were fighting too stubbornly against the Wehrmacht, which is the name for the German army. And by November, Hitler and his massive army, which was just outside the gates of Moscow, and honestly were hoping by this point that Moscow would be captured and the Soviets would have just surrendered, instead find themselves bogged down and getting slammed by General Winter. And to make things worse for the poor Germans, Hitler and his cronies basically believed that they weren't even going to need to worry about the winter. They were going to conquer Russia so quickly, so easily, they didn't even need to worry about bringing winter uniforms. So now you had German troops just outside the gates of Moscow in their summer uniforms getting pounded by General Winter, which arrived early in November. And by December 6th, 1941, outside the gates of Moscow, the German army found itself outside in temperatures listed as being 63 degrees below zero. The Germans, unable to handle this, wound up soon facing offensives from the Russians because the Russians knew how to attack in these conditions. Again, when you're culturally and historically in touch with the weather, you actually know how not just to survive in it, but how to attack in it. And the German army, in result, was thrown back. The Germans would never come this close to Moscow again. And the impact of General Winter would mark the beginning of the end for Hitler and the Third Reich.
Eight.
There are many people listening to this podcast who can probably say where they were and what they were doing when they got word of the Columbia disaster. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Columbia disaster was, though, the Columbia disaster happened back in 2003. And what happened was the space shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entering Earth's atmosphere, killing all 7 astronauts on board. It was a national tragedy, and it shook America's space program to its core. But what some people forget is that this wasn't the first time a space shuttle had been lost in an accident. This had actually happened before, 17 years earlier, when another space shuttle, Challenger, exploded 73 seconds after takeoff on the morning of January 28, 1986. Again, 7 astronauts, including a school teacher from New Hampshire who was supposed to be the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, were killed. Now, with the Challenger disaster, it was ultimately discovered that the main culprit was weather. And feeding off our last topic with Russia, the specific weather factor was cold. You see, what happened was that the initial launch date was set for January 22nd, 1986. But there were a series of issues. There were delays from the previous shuttle mission, which pushed the entire timetable back. There was bad weather. And there were also technical problems with the exterior access hatch on the shuttle. So the actual launch date was pushed back to the morning of January 28th. Now, what's important is what happened on the night of the 27th before the launch and the morning of the 28th before the launch. We're in Cape Canaveral, Florida, because this is where the space shuttle launches take place. But that night, in Cape Canaveral, Florida, on the night of the 27th and morning of the 28th, the temperature dropped all the way down to 26 degrees. 26 degrees in Cape Canaveral, Florida, which, by the way, is actually still the lowest recorded temperature for Cape Canaveral to this day. Now, with the temperature being so low, and of course this being such an unusual situation for Florida, this created a serious equipment problem on the shuttle that unfortunately wasn't going to be discovered by engineers and technicians until after the remains of the shuttle were being cleaned up from the Atlantic Ocean. The equipment problem involved a component called an O-ring. Now, what's an O-ring? An O-ring is very similar to a gasket or a washer that you would find in your household plumbing that keeps water from leaking out of the pipes when you have 2 pipes joined together. Now, the O-rings on the space shuttle work in the same way, except what they do is they keep pressurized hydrogen from leaking out of the rocket boosters. Specifically, the rocket boosters that use the pressurized hydrogen as fuel to launch the shuttle into space. And the problem with these O-rings was that they weren't designed to be used in cold weather, especially weather as cold as what happened that day in Cape Canaveral. It was later discovered again, too late for these astronauts, that a recommendation had been written that you cannot launch in temperatures below 50 degrees because of the possibility of the O-rings failing. 50 degrees, and the temperature was 26. So, with the temperatures in the 20s, far below that recommended temperature rating, and with the space shuttle about to launch, the O-ring failed in the rocket booster. Now, this particular launch of the space shuttle was a very highly televised event, specifically because of the teacher, Krista McAuliffe, being launched into space. So there is tons of video footage of this launch. And so there's tons of videos you can look at online that actually show the failure of the O-ring as it happened. For starters, there's a video where you can see gray smoke escaping from the side of the right rocket booster as the shuttle's lifting off. Another picture online shows a plume of hot gas shooting out the side of the booster 58 seconds into takeoff. 6 seconds later, 64 seconds into the flight, a leak began in the liquid hydrogen tank. And finally, at 73 seconds into the flight, the space shuttle, now essentially a bomb because of the leaking hydrogen, detonates, taking all 7 lives with it. Cold weather and a lack of awareness of how equipment on the shuttle could have been impacted by such cold forever altered America's space program.
Seven.
Now we're going to jump back about 400 years to 1588. And we're going to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean to talk a little about the Spanish Armada and how in 1588 bad weather played a role in defeating this mighty navy of 130 ships. So let's give some background on this. You have the Anglo-Spanish War between, fittingly, England and Spain, and it's been going on since about 1585. And now the King of Spain, Philip II, decides he wants to take the fight to England, because the war actually started with England first being the aggressor and invading across the English Channel and attacking portions of the Netherlands that were at the time controlled by Spain. So in 1588, under the command of an individual named the Duke of Medina Sidonia, the Spanish Armada of, again, 130 ships starts heading across the Channel towards England in an attempt to invade and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. Well, the British Navy knew they were coming, and as a result, a series of battles were fought, ultimately culminating in what was called the Battle of Gravelines at the end of July in 1588. And in that battle, the British defeated the Spanish fleet. Now, it wasn't a dominating victory for the British. The relative numbers are pretty low. I believe it was only 5 Spanish ships that were lost in the fight. However, it's what happened after the battle that makes this story so important on the world scale. So the Spanish Armada, defeated at the Battle of Gravelines, decides to turn north, and they're going to sail up along the east coast of England, possibly to find a place to land and actually still conduct this invasion they originally had planned before they ran into the British fleet. But the British still didn't allow this to happen. They followed the Spanish north, keeping them in sight and always keeping themselves between the Armada and the shores of England. And this continued all the way up the coast until the Spanish were off the coast of Scotland. At this point, the Spanish know that they're beaten. They're not going to be able to land on England's shores and conduct this invasion. And so now they have no choice but to just kind of limp back to Spain and regroup. But now they have a problem because they're all the way up in Scotland. And now they're at the mercy of the wind. Because remember, this is the era of sail. You don't have engines that you can use to just turn the ship around and head back home. You have to basically go where the wind is taking you. And so now the only way that these ships can get back to Spain is they have to go all the way around Scotland and come down the west side of Ireland and then get back to Spain that way. So they're doing this across open sea, with ships that are also, by the way, banged up from battle and just from being at sea for a long time. And in some of these cases, these ships are merely being held together by cables. But if the Spanish can just get around Scotland and Ireland, they can get back to Spain and kind of lick their wounds and get back to fighting the British properly. But Mother Nature decided that wasn't going to happen. 1588 is marked as one of the worst years in recorded history in terms of the sheer number and intensity of North Atlantic storms. Now, the Spanish Armada, which was attempting to sail around Scotland and England, was in the North Atlantic. And so they promptly got swept up in these storms. Many of the ships were dashed against the rocks of Scotland and Ireland, crushing and drowning thousands of men and destroying dozens of ships. In the end, Of the 130 ships and roughly 24,000 men that had left the shores of Spanish territory to attack England, only 67 ships and less than 10,000 men ever made it back to Spain. The defeat was terrible for Spain, and it helped the British to establish naval dominance over the next several centuries in Europe. When Philip II of Spain was told of this disaster and how the weather had destroyed the remnants of his fleet, he said, quote, "I sent the armada against men, not God's winds and waves," end quote. Now, the British, they looked at it a little differently. Medals were presented to the men who fought the armada, and they bore the words, quote, "Jehovah blew with his winds, and they were scattered," end quote.
Six.
Now we're going to switch to a topic that we hear a lot about today: climate change. Seems like everywhere we look in the media, in scientific papers, in the outdoor community, everywhere, there's rampant talk about the possibility and dangers of climate change. And maybe some of us think that climate change is strictly a modern phenomenon, a consequence of our hyper-industrial world. And while there may be some truth to that, the belief that it's strictly a modern phenomenon isn't true. The climate's always changing. It's changed constantly throughout human history. And when it does, it can play a role in launching some of the most famous events in world history. Case in point here, the French Revolution. The French Revolution, as a quick 101, was a 10-year event. It happened from 1789 to 1799, and it's punctuated by things like the monarchy being overthrown and guillotined, a republic being established, huge political upheaval, and ultimately ending with our friend Napoleon taking the throne and beginning his conquests of Europe, which ultimately, of course, led to his grand army freezing in Russia, but we covered that already. Let's go back to the revolution. There's a lot of talk within many historical circles about how climate change played a role in creating the circumstances that were needed for the French Revolution to launch. Now, usually that talk revolves around a period of time that was known as the Little Ice Age. Now, Earth has had countless ice ages that constantly come and go throughout the eons. And with each of these ice ages, temperatures are for extended periods of time lower than normal, creating rough winters and cooler than usual summers, which often result in a lot more rain. Now, we might think about ice ages being something that only woolly mammoths had to deal with, and, they would never happen in human history. But that's not true. From around 1300 to about 1850, and the dates vary a little bit depending on which historians you talk with. But from around 1300 to 1850, there was a period in world history that was known as the Little Ice Age, because in that time period, temperatures around the world were lower than average, which meant colder than normal winters and cooler than normal summers with more rain than usual. Now, in particular, there were 3 times where this Little Ice Age was particularly strong, and one of them started in the 1770s, which is about 2 decades before the French Revolution gets going. So over the next 2 decades, this unusual weather pattern, which is particularly strong at this time period, is hitting Europe. And then in 1788, it really hits a flashpoint. 1788 was a rough year for weather in Europe, especially France. There were periods of extreme drought, and when it rained, it typically would come in the form of massive downpours, which wouldn't do anything to actually nourish and replenish the soil. And then after that came the winter, with extremely cold temperatures, even by the standards of the last 2 decades. And with this 1, 2, 3 punch of drought, rain, and cold, crops and harvests began to fail. And really, it was a 1, 2, 3, 4 punch, because you also have to factor in that 4th point that crops and harvests had actually been doing pretty poorly overall the last 2 decades. And so now there's almost no supplies for food for the population. And with no food, that means that the cost of any remaining food is, of course, going to go skyrocketing. By 1789, as compared to just 4 years earlier, the price of wheat in France had increased 66%. Rye 71%, meat 67%, and firewood 91%. And meanwhile, wages in those 4 years had only increased by 22%. And so the portion of wages for an average city worker in France to pay for his food was believed to be around 88%. Could you imagine today in our society that we have to spend 88% of our income just to be able to have enough food on our tables? Think about how you now only would have 12% left to cover things like clothing, housing, everything else. It's probably safe to assume why revolts started in the cities. The people were starving, and the upper class was doing nothing to solve the problem. So, putting it simply, the starving masses, affected by the terrible effects of climate change in the Little Ice Age, picked up their weapons, stormed the Bastille, and launched one of the most famous revolutions in world history.
Five.
But it wasn't just the French Revolution that may have been sparked by climate change in the Little Ice Age. There was a haunting event that was happening on the other side of the Atlantic, back in America, that is believed to have also happened as a consequence of climate change. What am I talking about? The Salem Witch Trials. Again, a quick 101 lesson. The Salem Witch Trials were a series of hearings that happened from early 1692 to mid 1693 in colonial Massachusetts. Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft, and in the end, 30 of these people were found guilty. 19 of them were put to death by hanging, not by burning at the stake, by the way. That's a common misconception about the Salem Witch Trials. Another man was put to death by pressing, which means he was essentially crushed by heavy weights because he refused to plead. And another 5 people died in jail. Whether or not any of these people were actually witches, I'm not going to get into that. So we're going to need to step back 100 years from the French Revolution and go back to 1692 for these witch trials. And remember that the Little Ice Age, as I talked about earlier, was believed to have happened between the years of 1300 and 1850. Also, remember, as I said, that there were certain periods of the Little Ice Age that were particularly strong. The French Revolution may have been touched off by the strong spell that started in 1770. The Salem witch trials and the witch hunts in general throughout America and Europe, though, were touched off by another one of these particularly strong spells. The time period from 1680 to about 1730. The Salem witch trials, remember, happened in 1692, right in the midst of this cold spell. And in fact, it's interesting. If you look at the entire history of witchcraft trials in both America and Europe, you may notice the highest number of trials and witchcraft scares coincided with the exact same time periods where the Little Ice Age was particularly intense. Seems to be a correlation here. Now, why? Why would a cold spell or climate change be a possible reason for something like witch hunts and the Salem witch trials? What would cold weather have to do with any of this? Well, the answer probably lies within the concepts of scapegoating and superstitious belief. Popes and scholars at the time period, and not knowing any better, believed that witches were capable of controlling weather and being able to destroy crops because of the bad weather. So when you had cold spells and failing harvests, and people were suffering from the lack of food as a result, it became easier and easier to start pointing fingers at people and accusing them of witchcraft, which had put them in this situation. These people became the scapegoats for the failing crops, and it led to them being accused of witchcraft. Tad Baker, in his awesome book, A Storm of Witchcraft, put it pretty well when referring to why it was so easy to start accusing people of witchcraft when the weather took a turn for the worst. In this quote that I'm about to read, he's referring to Reverend Samuel Parris, who was a key character in the Salem witch trials. Baker says, quote, "Reverend Parris is arguing with his parish over the wood supply. A winter fuel shortage would have made for a fairly miserable colonial home. And the higher the misery quotient, the more likely you are to be seeing witches." End quote. To me, it's just as haunting to think about how people can turn on their neighbors and accuse them of witchcraft when things like climate change are happening, as it is to think about anything a supposed witch could actually do.
Four.
I'm going to say a couple things, and I want you to think about the name of a person or persons that is related to the two things I'm saying. Ready? Early 20th century, first manned flight of a heavier-than-air aircraft. All right, can you guess the person or persons I'm thinking of? Well, if you thought the Wright brothers, you're wrong. I'm actually thinking of a man named Samuel P. Langley, which is a name few of you are going to recognize. But he was very closely connected to the Wright brothers and the first attempt at manned flight. But as you can probably guess, he's not as famous as the Wright brothers because he was unsuccessful in his attempts. And one of the reasons he was unsuccessful? Weather. So let's start by talking about who Samuel Langley was. He was an astronomer, physicist, and inventor. And of course, as you can probably guess, he attempted to become the first person to achieve manned flight. Mr. Langley started by experimenting with model aircraft in 1887, which is 16 years before the Wright brothers had their success at Kitty Hawk. And in 1896, after 9 years of work, Langley ultimately achieved some success with his fifth prototype of an aircraft that he called the Aerodrome. Aerodrome number 5, on May 6, 1896, made 2 flights of 2,300 feet and 3,300 feet after being launched from a boat on the Potomac River near Washington, D.C. Again, this was an unmanned aircraft, so that's why it doesn't get into the history books as the first manned flight. Now, 6 months after this successful flight, Mr. Langley builds another aerodrome. This time, aerodrome number 6 made a flight of almost a mile. Now, the U.S. government at this point is getting very excited about Langley's work, and so the government decides to give him 2 grants of $70,000. And by the way, folks, the Wright brothers never got grants from the government to build their aircraft. And so Mr. Langley, with this grant money, hires a man named Charles Manley to try and pilot his aerodrome and thus become the first person to fly a manned aircraft. It's now 1903, and this time Langley is going to attempt twice with his aerodrome to do a manned flight with Charles Manley in the pilot seat. The first attempt is October 7th, 1903. Now, before I tell you the result of this first attempt, you should probably understand the difference between the aerodrome and the Wright brothers plane. And remember, during this exact same time period, the Wright brothers are doing their work down in Kitty Hawk, so it's basically a race to see who's going to be first. But the Wright brothers' plan for their plane, it was designed in such a way that the plane could fly against the wind, and a strong wind at that, and the plane could land on solid ground. Mr. Langley's aerodrome didn't have that design. It couldn't fly in anything other than calm wind, and it didn't have landing gear, so it had to land on water. And this is why they were working on the Potomac River, as I said earlier. And finally, and perhaps most importantly in terms of what happened, the aerodrome had to be launched from a boat in the middle of the Potomac River via a catapult. And this catapult was the reason for the first failure on October 7th, 1903. The moment the aerodrome was launched, part of the wing of the aerodrome struck part of the catapult, crippling the aircraft and plunging it into the Potomac River like, as quoted by a reporter on the scene, a handful of mortar. Manley, the pilot on board the aerodrome, was able to get away unharmed, by the way. And so with a complete repair, Langley and Manley are about to try again. It's now December 8th, 1903. Which is just 9 days before the Wright brothers would fly in Kitty Hawk. Langley was trying again to become the person responsible for the first manned flight and beat the Wright brothers to the punch. And this is a very exciting event for Langley. Press, military observers, members of Congress are lining the shore of the Potomac to watch what many believed was going to work and was actually going to be the first manned flight in American history. 4:45 p.m., with Manley in the pilot seat, the signal is given, the pins are pulled on the catapult, and the aerodrome is launched. And just as the pins are pulled, a huge gust of wind came up, and everything, well, it didn't go well. The platform on the boat lurched, the aerodrome's rear wings collapsed, and once again, this time because of wind, the aerodrome made a great nosedive right into the Potomac. Once again, Manley got away unhurt, but this time, the press in Congress had had enough. The papers mocked Langley and Manley the next day, and Congress began to criticize both the project itself and the grants they had given to Langley. But just 9 days later, the Wright brothers, without any government grants, 400 miles to the south, in prime weather conditions, and without any reporters covering it because of what happened with Langley, the Wright brothers were able to succeed where Langley had failed. And the Flyer, the first manned aircraft took flight. If that gust of wind hadn't blown at that exact moment for the aerodrome, who knows what might be taught in history classrooms today about the first manned flight. It's one of the most famous and most tragic events ever recorded on film. And there's a news reporter who said one of the most famous lines in history while recording the scene. His name was Herbert Morrison, and I'm going to play a clip of what he said in that moment.
It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the morning fast, and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I told you.
I'm talking, of course, about the Hindenburg disaster that occurred on May 6, 1937 at New Jersey's Lake Horse Naval Air Station. The Hindenburg, remember, was a large German zeppelin that carried passengers on journeys across the Atlantic, similar to the Titanic, except in the form of giant floating airship. The ship first entered service March 1936, and then, of course, met its tragic end in 1937 when it burst into flames and crashed while in the midst of landing in New Jersey, killing 35 people on board as well as one person on the ground. Now, there's actually still today a lot of debate going on regarding what exactly happened in the Hindenburg disaster. Most people agree, though, that it was a hydrogen explosion that caused the ship to burst into flames. The key thing about the Hindenburg and the other Zeppelins around the world at that time was that hydrogen was used as the gas that helped the ship fly. And hydrogen, of course, is extremely flammable. And this disaster is actually a key reason why helium is used in blimps around the world today, because helium is non-flammable. Interestingly, though, helium was the originally planned gas that was going to be used for Zeppelins like the Hindenburg, but the Germans ultimately had to turn to hydrogen because helium had two problems. It was more expensive, and it was more scarce back in the 1930s. And on top of all of that, helium was heavier than hydrogen, so it was easier to make the Zeppelins fly with hydrogen. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. A hydrogen explosion is almost certainly why the ship burst into flames. But the main debate now in historical circles is what exactly caused the hydrogen to ignite. I want to talk briefly about one theory that has been proposed in more recent years, and it involves storms. There's a couple of things involving physics that we have to consider here as part of this theory. The first is the actual material that the Hindenburg was made out of. Not the hydrogen gas in the ship, the physical material of the ship. Now, for starters, the Hindenburg had a skin that was made out of iron oxide that was coated with cellulose acetate. Essentially, what that means is it was two compounds that put together helped to create a moisture-proof seal around the airship. And on top of that, the paint that covered the acetate was stiffened with highly combustible powdered aluminum for added protection. But there's a problem with this, and as I mentioned with the powdered aluminum, these elements are highly flammable. And when combined together, they create a material that once it gets ignited by, say, an explosion of hydrogen, it's going to burn rapidly and it's going to burn really hot. And on top of that, with all these metal compounds, it's susceptible to electrical charges. So on May 6th, 1937, when the Hindenburg arrives in America after crossing the Atlantic, it can't land in New Jersey right away. It has to circle around New Jersey and New York City for about an hour because of poor weather conditions. And as the Hindenburg is circling, it's passing through those same storm clouds that were causing the bad weather. Storm clouds that are high in humidity and, of course, high in electricity. And doing this resulted in the metal exterior on the outside of the ship that I just referenced becoming negatively charged. So now you have a ship that is negatively charged as a result of the weather and is also filled with flammable gas. And of course has the extremely flammable exterior that's going to be able to burn hot and quickly once it gets going. So all you need for disaster to strike is a spark. And as the Hindenburg prepares to land, again, this is the theory, it drops a series of mooring cables from the ship to the ground. Now, these ropes, which are connected to the metal frame of the ship, become wet from the weather. And now they're acting as a ground, or a channel to conduct electricity. So the frame of the ship is now grounded, but the skin of the Hindenburg is not. And so now you have a rapidly changing difference in electrical charge between the skin of the ship and the frame of the ship, which is grounded. And the result of this difference? A spark. And the result of the spark? The hydrogen ignites. Boom. Within 10 seconds, the entire ship is ablaze. And within 34 seconds, the ship was on the ground, engulfed in fire. A true tragedy indeed.
Two.
On our first show, we talked a lot about perhaps the worst pandemic in world history, the Black Death, a version of bubonic plague that was believed to have originated in Asia and then was brought to Europe by rats, where the disease was spread by the bites of fleas that had been on those rats. Throughout the second half of the 1300s, it's estimated that half of Europe was killed. It was a terrifying, apocalyptic event that utterly changed the entire history of the Western world. But what a lot of people may not know is that it wasn't the first great plague to strike Western Europe. No, we're going to go back to 541 AD, where an equally apocalyptic plague struck. A plague that was known as Justinian Plague. Justinian Plague is believed to be the first major pandemic in recorded world history, and its numbers might be even more horrifying than the Black Death. Somewhere between 30 and 50 million people are believed to have been killed. Now, in terms of the death toll from other plagues, it may not seem as bad as, say, the Spanish flu, which may have infected up to 500 million people and killed over 50 million people in the early 20th century. But you also got to remember something. The population of the world in 541 is a heck of a lot smaller than it was in the early 20th century. Again, 30 to 50 million people are believed to have died from Justinian plague. And folks, that's believed to be about half of the world's population at the time. Could you imagine something like that happening today? A disease spreads that kills half the world's population? Back then, it was 30 to 50 million people. By today's standards, that would be the equivalent of about 3 to 3.5 billion people dying. How could our society cope with something like that without completely falling apart? It gives me chills thinking about it. But that's what happened back in 541. Now, this disease that was Justinian plague, which was believed to be primarily bubonic plague, just like the Black Death was, it's believed to have started in Egypt, and then it spread to Constantinople, which essentially was the hub of the known world at that time. Perhaps what made the Justinian plague so devastating was that it was the first time in history that a disease could spread far beyond the borders of where it originally came from, because the world was becoming a place with greater and greater commerce and people coming and going. People who were unable to understand that they were transmitting plague all around the world. Because remember, these people had no idea about microbes or how plague worked or how it was transmitted. To them, this was wrath of God stuff. The idea of quarantine and how to prevent exposure just didn't exist. So it was inevitable that the disease was going to spread. Now let's come back to the common theme of this show. How does weather tie into this? What did weather have to do with the spread of Justinian plague? Quite a lot, actually. We start by going into Egypt in 530, 11 years before the plague actually gets going. In 530, once again, climate change rears its ugly head in Egypt. And like the Little Ice Age that we talked about, it came in the form of a cold snap. Throughout northern Africa and southern Europe, there were periods in the 530s where snow would be seen in summer, where the number of sunny days was way below average, and of course, temperatures were way below average. And like the Little Ice Age, vegetation and crops began to wither and die. Food chains were upset. And it wasn't just the human populations in these areas that were suffering. It was the entire animal food chain. And this is where it all starts to come together. You see, with the dying of crops, you first have small animals dying because they aren't able to eat things like grain because the crops are failing. And the most important of these small animals? Rats. When these animals, particularly rats, start to die, the larger animals that feed on the smaller animals start to die. And so overall, you have a decrease in the populations of both the small animals and the larger animals that feed on the small animals. And then once this die-off happens, the climate shifts again around the 540s, namely in the form of unusually high rainfall. Now, the rainfall has an effect where it creates the conditions necessary for the small animals, especially rats, to revive and boost their numbers back to where they were prior to the original die-off. But now there's a catch. The larger animals that fed on these animals, like the rats, aren't around in nearly as large of a number as before. And the result? You have a higher number of rats that carry things like bubonic plague. So before long, Africa becomes inundated with rats, mice, and gerbils. The disease springs up in 541, the disease is transported to Constantinople and Europe, and by the time the disease, which was launched by the effects of climate change, burns itself out, half of the world's population is dead. Imagine, if you will, that one of the reasons America won its independence from Great Britain was because of the effects of a hurricane. Imagine that it's 1774, and tensions are already high between the American colonies and the British Crown. The Boston Tea Party happened at the end of 1773, so it's pretty clear that the colonists are unhappy and they're already thinking about independence. But now imagine something that's a little different from how history actually went. Imagine a great hurricane slams into Boston and wreaks havoc throughout New England. And this actually isn't too crazy of a concept to think about, because back in 1938, a massive hurricane nicknamed the Long Island Express actually went through New England and killed over 700 people. So now imagine something like that happening in the American colonies in the 1770s, specifically 1774. A massive hurricane with 130 mile per hour winds rips through New England. And when it's finally over, imagine that almost 200,000 people, about 10% of New England's population at the time, and almost half the population of Boston, is dead from this one storm. Now imagine that the American colonists, while of course still agitated at the crown, are still nevertheless subjects, and so they plead for help from Britain, some form of relief. But King George, through a combination of incompetence and a form of detesting the American colonies for their recent behavior, basically goes, "Nah, I'm not going to help out. They can take care of themselves. Serves them right." And so this enrages the American colonists and serves as the great catalyst. Mass demonstrations erupt. And by the end of 1774, about 5 months before the actual American Revolution started, the colonists in Britain are now in full-scale war. And America, driven by its collective rage over the Crown's non-response to the hurricane, wins its independence in just 9 months instead of the 8 years that it actually took. That's a pretty crazy twisting of history, right? Well, I'm not too far off, I think, from describing a variation of something that actually did happen. Except the actual event that did happen happened in 1970 and 1971. And it happened on the other side of the globe, where the role of Britain in this story is played by Pakistan, and the role of the American colonies is played by Bangladesh. And the Great New England Hurricane is played by the actual hurricane that was named the Great Bola Cyclone. So now we flip back to reality and what actually happened. It's November of 1970, and in the Bay of Bengal, which separates India from Southeast Asia, a great cyclone forms. I'm switching gears here, by the way, and I'm saying cyclone instead of hurricane because these storms are only called hurricanes when they're in the Atlantic Ocean. When they're in the South Pacific and Indian Oceans, they're known as cyclones. They're really the same thing. I just want to clarify that. So, this cyclone becomes known as the Great Bola Cyclone. When you look at the historical record for this storm, it doesn't actually rank among the all-time storms in terms of its strength. Although it was a monster with maximum sustained winds of 115 miles per hour and gusts over 160 miles an hour, there are many, many cyclones in the Indian Ocean that have been far worse. This cyclone specifically was just barely the strongest storm to form that year in the Indian Ocean. But that's not what this storm is famous for. The Great Bola Cyclone has gone down in history as the deadliest tropical cyclone ever. And the reason why was because of two things. Number one, exactly where it hit when it came on shore. And two, the lack of warning given to the people in the area that it actually hit. Now, the storm came ashore right over the nation of East Pakistan, the nation that would eventually, at the end of this story, become Bangladesh. And unfortunately, it came ashore over the most densely populated area of the country, the Ganges Delta. This area, to give you an idea, is a series of lowlands that rise only a few feet above sea level and are filled with poorly constructed homes that are built by a population wallowing in poverty. Basically, imagine the squalor of a massive shanty town. You know, like the huge, tightly packed settlements of houses that are basically built out of nothing more than plywood and cardboard boxes. Now imagine them all stuck together in the area where New Orleans is today. Now, let's remove all the levees and pumps and all modern forms of technologies that exist to keep out the seawater and storm surges from things like hurricanes or cyclones. Now, remove all forms of warning systems. Now, pack millions of people into this low-lying area of shanty towns. And then, finally, hit it with a storm as large and as intense as Hurricane Katrina. That's what happened in November of 1970. The people in the Ganges Delta were essentially living at sea level, completely exposed to the sea and the storm surge and the high winds, and had nothing other than poorly constructed buildings to ride out the storm. On top of that, they had no warning the storm was even coming. There's all sorts of reasons for this, but the main reason is believed to be because the weather stations in India that knew of the storm did very little to notify East Pakistan because of all the Indian and Pakistani frictions that existed at the time. So in the end, it was the worst and deadliest cyclone in world history. By the time it was all over, villages were gone, crops were destroyed, and more than 500,000 people were dead. The events that followed the storm are worthy of a podcast in and of itself. But if you thought the U.S. government's response to Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans in 2005 was bad, you'd be stunned at how awful the Pakistani government responded to the crisis in East Pakistan. While the Pakistani government pledged $116 million for relief efforts, within 10 days of the storm actually hitting, the Pakistan military had deployed a grand total of 3 gunboats, 1 hospital ship, 1 military transport aircraft, and 3 crop dusting aircraft to all of East Pakistan to help with the relief efforts. When attacked viciously over this poor response, the president of Pakistan at the time said, "There have been mistakes, there have been delays, but by and large, I'm very satisfied that everything is being done and will be done." This lack of response and perceived lack of caring resulted in misery for the suffering East Pakistanis, and of course, it fueled rage. In December 1970, 1 month after the storm, the Awami League, which is a party that supported independence for East Pakistan from Pakistan, swept to a landslide victory, and the cries for rebellion began to roar throughout the devastated nation. And by March of 1971, East Pakistan was at war. And by the end of 1971, East Pakistan was no longer East Pakistan. It was now the independent nation of Bangladesh. The most deadly cyclone in world history had helped create a brand new nation.
Zero.
Hope you enjoyed the show, everybody. I want to add a little postscript before we wrap up. I guess for starters, I want to apologize for the delay between the second show and this one. It's been a goal of ours to release a new show at least once every couple of weeks, but we fell behind the 8 ball a little bit because we were in the midst of making a cross-country move and setting up a new studio. We still have some work to do with it, but at least we're up and running again, and we plan to be on track now for a new show at least once every 2 weeks. Secondly, I wanted to give you an idea of where we're thinking of going with the show. For our next show, at least, I want to move away a little bit from the template we've been following for the first few shows, which has been 10 times blank changed world history. I want to try a different angle for the next show, at least, and talk about 10 human interest stories from the American Civil War. It's a little more specific, and hopefully it's just as, if not much more, entertaining and informative than what we've already done. We hope that you'll enjoy it, but I also want to stress that this is a very flexible project. We're always looking for ideas or suggestions on topics that we can cover. And if you, the listener, have any suggestions or ideas for us, please let us know. We love getting feedback and advice so that we can make this show the best it can possibly be. So if you would like to give us feedback and suggestions, you can do this by messaging us or commenting on our social media pages. We're on Facebook, The History 10s, as well as Twitter and TikTok at The History 10s. And we're also on YouTube as well. And of course, we would love it if you could subscribe and leave a rating and review for the show on iTunes as well. We take that as the highest compliment because it helps the show get noticed. Thanks for your support, everyone. We really appreciate it. And thanks also for listening. Until next time, I'm Andrew Baldwin with The History 10s. For more information, including our show notes, don't forget to check out our website at www.history10s.com. If you like this show, and if you felt the show was worth a buck, please feel free to donate $1 or whatever you feel is right on our Patreon page or through our PayPal, which is linked on our website, www.history10s.com. Also, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter on www.history10s.com for more information and how to get more updates on the show. Thanks again, everyone.